Hello, welcome to GlobeDocs Monthly. I'm here with filmmakers Helen Dabrowski and Sarah Colt. Their film, Fly With Me, tells the story of the pioneering young women flight attendants on the front lines of the battle to assert more gender equality and transform the workplace. Featuring firsthand accounts, personal stories, and rich archival record, the film tells the dynamic and important but neglected history of women who changed the world while flying it. Welcome, Helen. Welcome, Sarah.
Hi, how are you?
Great. I'm
Thank you
so
so
glad you're
much.
here. So let's start with the basics. What made you interested in the plight of flight attendants to begin with?
Well, I could take this one or start it off. Sarah and I were first drawn to a book by Julia Cook, who is one of our interviewees. It's called Come Fly the World. And when we started to learn about flight attendant history, we were really excited because this history really checked all the boxes for what would make a really good documentary film. We were pretty sure that we could find witnesses who could tell their stories firsthand. There's amazing archival. There's a nostalgia factor for sure. But I think most importantly, we were excited to tell a history that is kind of surprising, a different side of the story that I don't think a lot of people might have known about. And then as female filmmakers, the opportunity to tell or explore a social justice story from a feminist perspective was also a really exciting opportunity.
How about you, Sarah? Do you have anything to add?
I think Helen really nailed it in the sense that you're looking, as filmmakers, you're looking for stories that people don't know, but then also stories that are well suited to the craft. And so this one just kind of felt like we were, the minute we sort of started to dig into it, we kind of knew we were onto something. And also the fact that there weren't films about this subject. So there were just so many things that pointed towards making a documentary about it. And ultimately, it became a 2 hour for American Experience. We were very lucky that American Experience wanted to make the film. And initially, it was supposed to be a 1 hour. And the more research we did and the more women that we found and the stories we wanted to tell, we realized that it was going to be needed to be longer. We were worrying about that. But then luckily, our executive producer kind of got it. And she right away said, I think this might be a 2 hour. And we were thrilled.
Amazing, amazing. And for everybody who's tuning in, I just want to make sure that you all know that we have a Q&A. Please, if you have questions of your own, please submit them. We'll be glad to take them as we go along. So for both of you, but let's start with you, Sarah. What was your decision making around referring to these women as stewardesses for a majority of the film over flight attendants or air hostesses? What's the distinction there?
What's really interesting is that in a narration-driven film, we would have made a decision. What are we going to say? This film is witness-driven. We did speak with experts and we have interviews with them, but we didn't write any narration. We could have, when we interviewed the women, said, you know what, we don't want to use the term stewardesses. It's an out of date term. We don't talk about it. But the women themselves called themselves stewardesses. So the decision in some ways was almost made for us because you don't want to interrupt a conversation with an 80-year-old woman and say, oh, no, we're saying flight attendants, not stewardesses. Like they own the stewardess title. That was what they were called until kind of the mid 70s. And our story ends right at the time that this name change happened. And we did actually try there, with a film like this, any film, you go through so many versions. And we did have an ending that kind of included that name change because we thought it was quite symbolic and important, but ultimately it didn't work. And we ended up with a different ending. But we just embraced what the women were calling themselves. And that just, it would have been hard to get them to not use the term stewardess.
Right, right. And just a shout out real quick, we got a anonymous attendee asking, how can my friends see the film? You can see the film on PBS right now. It's a quick Google, you'll get right to the link. Otherwise, the PBS app also has the film. Helen, did you want to add anything on that stewardess over flight attendants answer? Or?
I mean, just Sarah pretty much covered it. I mean, I would say that in some of our conversations, and we spoke with many, many flight attendants, most of them retired. Um, but I would ask them at the beginning of the conversation, what do you prefer? And it was very clear. There were a couple that preferred flight attendant, but for the most part, they said I was a stewardess and I'm proud of it. And that was what they wanted. So it was sort of an interesting thing for me to learn. I wouldn't have thought that going into the project.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if that shows that the term stewardess has this kind of iconic sheen to it that flight attendant really just doesn't have. So let's start with when you decided on this project, did you have any expectations about the stories you were going to hear? Did anything surprise you? Did anything not surprise you? Let's start with you, Helen.
There are a lot of things that surprised me. There was a lot I didn't know. So to tell a surprising story, we kind of had to get hit with it first. But one of the big things that really stood out to me was the fact that there were civilians flying troops to and from Vietnam. I hadn't really thought about that. The fact that commercial airlines were being chartered, and that someone who had no training in this particular area was in charge of bringing troops and having, being both in physical danger. Sometimes the planes were being shot at, or just the psychological impact of having to bring humor and comfort to the people who would be fighting on the ground in Vietnam, and knowing that some of them wouldn't be coming back on the flights and then returning on the flights. We have a really powerful story from Celeste Lansdale Brodigan in the film, who flew on some of those flights. And, to this day, I think it seemed to me when she was telling us these stories that those were some of the most impactful moments of her career. And she's very proud of them for good reason.
Yeah, absolutely. What about you, Sarah?
I think that what we hopefully draw out in the film was what we were struck by when we started talking and interviewing flight attendants. And we did talk to many that didn't end up in the film, but helped us tremendously in the research and the figuring out how to tell this story. And that was all the contradictions that went into being a stewardess. The expectations that you were a safety professional, but at the same time, you were also expected to be a hostess who was smiling, wearing 3-inch heels, making sure people were comfortable, never saying no. There was this just tremendously long list of contradictions in terms of the expectations. And I think the flying in and out of Vietnam was like sort of in some ways the pinnacle, like, being shot at, but at the same time being expected to always have a smile, always have your lipstick perfect. It was fascinating to kind of understand and dig into all of that. And of course, that is sort of the tension of the role and the story, are these contradictions.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that's a perfect segue. A huge theme of this story is that fundamental incompatibility between being somebody who's there to comfort or to be beautiful or to wait on versus this complex work, which is knowing the physics of an airplane, knowing what to do in a crisis. So let's talk about that on that front. Let's start here. Earlier on in the film, with the invention of pressurized cabins, flight was mainstream, it blew up. Women learned the physics. They had to learn all the safety precautions and how to operate in a crisis because more and more people were flying. And they had to know all of this and present an air of reassurance, of knowledge, and be docile and submissive. So, how did the women you interviewed, especially in that time in the 60s and the 50s, understand themselves in that dissonance? Did they just accept this contradiction, or did they think it was a part they had to play?
I mean, I'm going to jump in here and say that I think, and I'll see what Helen thinks, but I think what is interesting about it is that what it tracks the societal changes are tracking very closely to what the experience of the women in our film are having. And so I think for, we have some early activists in Dusty Rhodes and Pat Banks, Edmiston, who are in the 50s and they're seeing a wrong and they're working to right a wrong. But most of the women we talked to became flight attendants and had a very sort of traditional expectation of what the job was going to be. And then something changed, and that something was a combination of the independence that they had as flight attendants, the sort of experience, the maturity, what was happening to them as they're traveling, some of them all over the world, some of them just around the country. And then at the same time, we have the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1965. And what that does, now there's a law that says that women have to be treated equally in the workplace. And so the world is changing, the women themselves are changing, and sort of that's all tracking simultaneously for our main characters who we highlight in the film. So what we loved, Patricia Ireland, one of the most famous women at the front lines of fighting for women's rights, 10 years the head of the National Organization for Women. She started out as a young woman looking for a good job after college to help pay for her husband who was in law school. She just needed a job. And then the job was what then transformed her.
How about you, Helen? How do you remember the women accepting this contradiction?
I think, especially in the early years, they might not necessarily have seen it as a contradiction. And that's what a lot of them said to us. This was the job, it was presented to them. They knew what the requirements were. And I think at the time, especially for some of them who were quite young and oh, I can't get married. I'm going to have to quit if I get married, or I'll quit when I turn 32 or 35. That wasn't, that seemed so far away for some of them. And they talk a lot about that. And so that was a job. It was coveted. It was sort of a high level, interesting job. And they had been specially selected for it because they had this ability to do it all. And so I think, initially, especially in the early years, didn't feel like as much of a contradiction. And then, of course, when they sort of, as Sarah said, personally come up against some of these things that you start to realize, well, wait, I want to get married, but I don't want to stop working this job. And wait a second, why can't I be married? Or why can't I have children? Or, why can't I be a certain age? So that those contradictions really start to irk them. And that's when you see these interesting fights starting to happen.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that it wasn't necessarily a contradiction early on. That actually makes me reflect a little bit just now about what we consider contradictions. Like, you can be an independent woman and also want to get married, and that's totally normal. It's just the context of what you're operating in. We have some more Q&As here coming in. Someone has said, I agree that civilian stewardesses flying troops into war zones was very surprising. When they were assigned to those flights, did they volunteer, have a choice, or was it a mandatory assignment? Sarah, why don't you take that?
Well, it's really interesting because there was, I would say it's a combination of things. So some people did volunteer. Some people were, everything is based on seniority. So if you weren't like this, more senior stewardesses got to choose what they wanted to do. And in fact, an aspect of Mary Pat Laffey's story, she's highlighted in the film, and we tell her very important story in the sort of final part of the film. An aspect of her story is that when she starts to fight back and she's fighting for women to be treated equally to men on planes, she gets sent to Vietnam. Like, she actually, it was a punishment basically by the airline that she has to go to Vietnam, even though she was a more senior person. So that's a great question. It's a great question.
So being a stewardess, what struck me about it is that it was considered a very adventurous job for good girls, at least in the early part. And yet they were also recruited, and this is even before the Fly With Me campaign, before the kind of sexualization, overt sexualization of the stewardesses. Even before that, you know, they were recruited. There was one line in it that said, "Would you like a boyfriend in every city of the world?" And yet it was still seen as like an acceptable, I'm not sure what the word is, but you know, a proper job for a young woman to have. Like it wouldn't be, you know, it would be glamorous, in fact. And then later, as the 60s and the Fly With Me campaign came in, they were kind of turned into these Barbie dolls that were sexually available and yet also responsible for flying in and out of Vietnam. Um, so how much of that messaging about their sexuality and their, you know, completely erroneous, you know, dumb stereotype, how much of that do you think lingers today? Do you think this dichotomy is a hard one to shake off?
Helen, do you have,
Go ahead. I mean, we both have thoughts on it. Go ahead.
no, you go first.
Well, I mean, yes,
Hot
absolutely. I
potato.
think it lingers. It lingers a lot. I mean, you know, it's interesting. Like even reading, and of course, you know, you make a film, and you want to know what people think about it, and you see comments, you know, for better, you know, great ones. And then you also see ones that are bemoaning certain things about flight attendants today, or, you know, why can't they be, you know, oh, I miss the hot pants. And, you know, there's certain comments. So yeah, I mean, I think it lingers. Sarah and I were talking, you know, at one point, and we were saying, like, you know, flight attendants, what these women fought for, and they accomplished, was to make this a real career, and also to be open to anybody of any gender, you know, any body size. Still, to, you know, there's still some limits, but that opened up, any age. And so now, you know, anybody can be a flight attendant, but they're not paid very well. And, you know, there's certain things that we've seen where they're not treated very well. The pandemic really showed that. I think it brought it to light, where they're expected to be professional, and handle these really difficult situations, but also be very much customer service oriented. So they're still doing that kind of both sides, a little bit of everything.
Yeah, absolutely. How about you, Sarah? What do you think?
I think Helen really covered it. I do think, I mean, what I would say is that we did somewhat struggle with where should this film end, where, you know, because there's a lot more to the story that we don't tell. There's deregulation, there's some big strikes, there's a TWA strike that's really, in the early 80s. There's a lot more to this story. And you know, you have to decide where to end a story. Sometimes there's a natural, obvious end. There wasn't a natural, obvious end to this. So we cut ourselves off before deregulation. We felt like we were really telling the story of these early, front of the line feminists who were figuring out how could they get treated better in the workplace for women. And so that was where we ended, which was the early 70s. But there's a lot more to this story. I think, you know, maybe we'll get to tell it. I don't know who will tell it in documentary, but I think there's more to it.
Yeah, how different do you think a documentary that picks up right where you guys ended and takes it to today would be? I mean, this is just a fun hypothetical here.
I mean, I just think there's a whole, I mean, corporate story. There's the deregulation story. There's a government and corporation
Mhm.
story that, you know, none of that makes it into our film. Yeah, no, that's a good question. But there's definitely more to say.
There's
Abs-
there's more to say. I mean, there are a number of people who have written things that take the story closer to the present day. And another one of our interviewees, Phil T. Meyer, wrote a book, and he is specifically focusing on male flight attendants. And that's a really fascinating story. There were male stewards throughout the history. They were actually the first stewards on the plane. And, we cover in the film why it really shifted to a predominantly female role. But there is a really interesting male side story to it. So that would be another thing I think a film that kind of covers up to the present day could explore.
Yeah, that's a perfect way into a couple of our comments here. Someone said, did you discover interesting issues for male flight attendants after almost all attendants were women? And I know that that wasn't your focus, but did it come up at all that on the cutting room floor?
Well, interestingly, the big legal case that does sort of change the tide in terms of who women in the workplace as flight attendants was a man suing to become a flight attendant. And, that was complicated for us. We thought about telling that story, but we really felt like we had to have a female-centered story, and that was a breakthrough case that affected the women, but we didn't tell that story. It's a great story. It's an interesting story, and there's it's an LGBTQ story in terms of many of the men who, which were only for a period, only about 5% of the population of flight attendants who were men, but many of them, it was a way to be more openly who they were and their sexuality by sort of flying. Anyway, it's a very interesting story, and I think Phil's book would be a great place to start to make that film. I'm getting a very big reflection from the sun going down. Got to move here.
Another comment said, I have not seen the film yet. Did you research stewardesses who flew during World War II? The Skorsky flying boat flying to Ireland to drop off dignitaries for secret meetings. Only 16 passengers and stewardesses slept in the plane's tail. It seems your film did not go back that far, but it is very interesting as an era, and the daughters and sons of such pioneering women are still alive to interview for part 2, smiley face. They had to be nurses, for example. It's a good backstory. Much can be learned at the New England Air Museum. That's a great comment. Did you research the stewardesses who flew during World War II? Is the question in there.
I don't think we dug into that too much. I do think it's absolutely fascinating. I think when the history of women in flight in general too, we do go back to that time period. But no, it's not something we really went into. There are definitely a number of areas that if we had more hours, we would have covered in depth. And now I definitely have to learn about the flying boat flying to Ireland. I mean, that sounds so good. I mean, the story like that, about the stewardess sleeping in the plane's tail. I mean, there is no dearth of really fascinating things like that. Dusty said one time she was on, talking about unruly passengers, and on one flight, there was a gentleman who was really out of control, and she ended up hitting him with a coffee pot to kind of subdue him. I mean, and that was a long time ago. Clearly that would not go so well today, and then some other passengers helped, hold him down. But there are all sorts of these stories where, wow, you wouldn't have realized that they're doing these incredibly brave things like that. But no, thank you to that person for sharing that. I'm excited to learn more.
So being a stewardess was an excuse to travel alone, and that no one knew what you did between flights. This was kind of a cheeky moment in the film. Do you know what they did? Did anyone tell you some interesting tales between flights?
Interestingly, I'm sure there was some wild behavior that went on, and that's certainly documented in some of the books that we read. Not necessarily wild, but like swimming late at night off the beaches of, Senegal, and, sort of fun things that people did. But in an interesting way, we it was also, and we do tell this in the film, just the opportunity to learn, the opportunity to eat different food, the opportunity to go to museums and just really get what travel really can do, which is to open you up and make you see your own culture differently because you've seen another culture. But there was also a wonderful thing that our one of our witnesses told us, and it didn't make it into the film, but she, Celeste, whose story we tell about how she, fought to be married and be a flight attendant. She ultimately became a single mother, and she tells of just being so happy to be in a hotel room by herself with no children around and nobody asking her for anything and just being able to lie on the bed and order room service. That for women, and I think women can relate to that even today, the sort of the independence of that, the freedom of that, to be just alone is was sort of in a way the best story that we heard. I mean, I think we also heard a story, Helen, about a woman who was just so excited, like the bed, there was like a bed that,
Put
they used to have
quarters
those.
in and it would shake.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And just being able to lie on the bed and get like a little back rub or whatever. Anyway.
So to go back to this idea, this notion that these women were hired for their beauty as like a central tenet early on, even if they could offer so much more. How much of an effect did stewardess's beauty have on the future union negotiations and the civil rights lawsuits that came later? It struck me that there was one point in the film where someone had mentioned like it's hard to say no to a beautiful woman. They don't expect you to be, assertive. Um, so would you consider that kind of a poetic echo of how the beautiful young women were brought in to begin with to make men feel safer, and then also could be a benefit in negotiating?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really difficult to know. It's not something we really measure, like how effective the beauty was. But I would say that they're definitely capitalizing on um, the stereotype as a flight attendant as beautiful and attractive. They're very savvy. They've got this really great ability to know how to handle people. I mean, that's part of what they were hired for. And so they bring that into these situations where they're trying to advocate for change. So Dusty Rhodes, she just tells the best story about how, you call up a reporter and you say flight attendant, immediately they want to be there. Like they're going to cover the story. It makes for really good press. And so yes, she's using her sexuality, her beauty, but it's that intelligence, it's that cleverness of, okay, well, I'm going to make this work for me. And so they get the press there and they get the word out. And they use that, and they use their physicality to show that this age rule is ridiculous. Can you tell who's over 32 or under 32? Like, aren't we all beautiful? And so there's another one of our interviewees, Katie Berry, who wrote this amazing, one of the most comprehensive books about flight attendant history and female flight attendants, really does a great job of talking about this in the film. So yeah, the beauty is definitely one of the weapons in their arsenal, but I would say it's really more due to how savvy and smart and clever they are.
Yeah, especially that moment where one flight attendant was discussing how they had to subdue unruly passengers, but do so with a smile so that they didn't feel so subdued. That is a certain type of emotional intelligence and charm that is very difficult to learn. I'm going to take it over to a couple comments. Anne Keeley says this documentary is Oscar worthy. Thank you, Anne Keeley. Another person asks, how were the issues the same or different with international airlines, especially those who did not fly to the US?
I feel like we were making an American experience. That's the series. And we really, as we were fairly absorbed with the American experience, and we didn't learn that much about what other countries were doing in terms of their flight attendants. So it's a good question, and I don't really have the answer to it.
The only thing I would say, I don't know much more except that there some of the standards that some of the American flight attendants were able to, I wouldn't say standard, the rules that some of the American flight attendants were able to fight to overturn still persisted for a longer amount of time in other countries. And I think, I mean, anecdotally, I believe there's some countries that still have very stringent weight requirements, sort of beauty, whatever the cultural standard of beauty is there, those kind of requirements. So it's an interesting thing to explore for sure.
Another question, when women began being accepted as commercial airline pilots, did the pressures on flight attendants lessen or change?
Well, I think that when things started to open up for women to become pilots was just at the moment when the job of flight attendant was becoming more diversified by, age and ethnicity and gender. So I don't think I mean, it's an interesting question. I don't know. I don't know the answer to it, but my supposition is that it wasn't easy to be a female pilot. Took a long, and it may not be that easy even to this day. And that the problems within, the world of the flight attendant, some of them got better, but there were other persistent issues.
And this isn't super, it's tangentially related to that, which is that there's actually a good number of flight attendants that we spoke with who had their pilot's license, just on the side, learned how to do it, or who initially wanted, like Dusty wanted to be a pilot. That was her initially what she wanted to do, but it wasn't an occupation that was open to her as a woman. So I think I always found that kind of interesting, and in the story that a lot of them had that initial goal.
And the thing that was really like universal in this film was that people who became flight attendants loved flying, like flying. And I think it is sort of interesting to come from a contemporary perspective because flying has become so kind of regular, almost like taking a bus. Like it's not that big a deal to take a plane somewhere, but you have to, like, we really thought and worked to create that sense of wonder over flying at the beginning of the film because we felt like it was really important to take people back to a time when flying was like flying. I mean, going up in an airplane was like maybe what it would be like today to go into a spaceship. Like it was a very big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we didn't get into this, but it's something that I did note. The fact that flights were regulated meant that they had to compete on experience. And that is such an interesting point to see. The flight attendants played such a crucial role in making the experience competitive with other airlines. So to shift a little bit, while Dusty Rhodes fought for white women to work beyond the age of 32, Pat Banks fought for women, Black women, to be able to work at all. And what were some of the considerations you made in telling this overarching story of stewardesses when their stories had overlaps, but also were different fights? How did you
So
decide
it,
to do that?
so I feel like what became really crucial and what was, what makes a film like this hard to figure out in terms of the narrative arc is that there's no obvious narrative arc for this film. A lot of what happens kind of in an overlapping way. So, there was a lot happening in the 60s, and it's sort of, when do you begin this aspect of the story? When do you, tell this story? But what we realized in our tremendous luck and just privilege to be able to tell both Dusty's story and Pat's story, both of whom have been written about. So we kind of knew about them, and we weren't sure they were even still alive because they had done the work that they did in the 50s. What we really came to realize in doing the research was that what Pat Banks's fight, which is really a civil rights fight, is what makes possible the women's movement in the 60s and early 70s. So the civil rights movement is what pushes this country to pass the Civil Rights Act. It wouldn't have happened without people like Pat Banks. And then the passage of the Civil Rights Act then opens the door for the fight for gender equality in the workplace. And so we wanted to make sure we told that story and you understood that this was something happened and then it allows for something else to happen. And that Dusty Rhodes was fighting for something, but she was very limited to what she was able to do because there was no teeth behind, there was no law that made it so that airlines had to, I mean, they could discriminate. They legally could discriminate until the passage of the Civil Rights Act. So that became a very important sort of before and after moment of in the filmmaking and sort of how to build the film. And then we just felt so privileged and were so ecstatic when we discovered that Pat was living in the Bronx and somebody, you know, we made this film in New York City and we were able to just meet her and she was excited to be part of it. And we just were thrilled about that.
Undra, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. Undra or Undra was also a flight attendant you interviewed, and she fought to be included in the advertisement that was controversial, the Fly With Me advertisement. One interviewee had said that it was basically a way to say F me instead of, you know, it was a very sexualized campaign, and yet Undra wanted to be included in that and felt empowered by being included in that by representing Black women. Could you speak to how that campaign itself could be sexist and yet also be something that somebody would want to be a part of in the name of equality, and how you chose to convey that?
Well, let me just start by saying it's Fly Me, not Fly With Me.
I'm sorry.
We titled the film Fly With Me, but the campaign was Fly Me. Just to clarify.
Yes, thank you. Didn't realize I said fly with me. Fly me.
I would say, I mean, so Undra is amazing. And I could sort of back up a little bit by saying that we had a really amazing associate producer, Talia Moore, who found Undra and cultivated a relationship of trust with her so that she was willing to talk to us on camera. And that definitely might not have been the case. I think she shared some very difficult, traumatic things, and some of them we cover in the film, some of them we don't, but she's an amazing individual. And I think, you know, initially there's also this commercial called The Losers, which is, you know, on one hand, when we were thinking about how to weave in the advertisements, we weren't quite sure where it was going to go, and sort of what would be the point of it, because the commercial shows different women, and they all have something wrong with them that disqualifies them from the position of a flight attendant, because being a flight attendant is so elite. So one has glasses, one's too young, one's married, one's too tall, one bites her nails, these sort of kind of ridiculous, silly things. And what we spoke with historians about was, you know, this is all very interesting in regards to the rules, but the other interesting thing is that none of the women are Black. There are no women of color in this group. So it's sort of like completely implied that you also, another disqualification for you is that you are Black. So coming up into the sexualized campaign of Fly Me, yeah, it could be really offensive, but Undra tells, like, flips that story, because she's saying, you know what, this is my chance to show that Black women can do this job. Like, there is no reason we can't. So why shouldn't I be the face of an ad campaign? And in fact, that has an impact. You know, that representation matters. And she encountered other flight attendants who saw her on the billboard or in the print ads and said, okay, wow, like, there's someone like me, and I can also do this job. I didn't realize that Black women were doing this job. So I think it complicates the story, and it shows that, the sort of the white women's problem was sort of one thing, but then there's this whole other aspect to it, that women of color were fighting for and fighting against, that brings things a little deeper.
Absolutely. I'm going to take it back to the Q&A here. Burb says, so grateful for this film giving me a look into the experience my mother had flying on the Pan Am Clipper between Norway and the UK in the early 50s. She passed away 25 years ago, and I regret not learning more about this and other parts of her young life. Interesting to see how nearly all the stewardesses looked like her. Thank you, Burb. Another question here. Were there any male airline corporate executives who championed the cause of women flight attendants?
We did not find any. It was interesting in our kind of discussions of how to tell this story, like, would there be anyone from the airlines to sort of defend the decisions? And I think what first of all, a lot of them are no longer with us. It was, they were older at that time, and so they're no longer alive. But we really, it was really a witness driven from the women's perspective, the storytelling. So we did not, and we didn't, in the research, there wasn't somebody that we sort of wished we had talked to who had a different perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely know there was some union, the people in the unions. So flight attendants were in the same unions. They shared unions, or they were adjacent to some of the pilots' unions. There were male stewards in some of the unions. There are definitely colleagues that advocated for them. The executives, I'm not entirely sure. Although I would say, it was really a big part of this was like a financial decision too. I mean, to be able to have a female flight attendant and pay her, even though she's doing the same job as a male steward or a male purser, you give him a slightly different title. You can pay him more money, but there's fewer of them. There's so many female flight attendants. Why would you, if you're just thinking financially of the bottom line, why would you want to give them the same rates of pay? So I not necessarily a male airline corporate executive thing, but they're clearly the ones making this decision, and it wasn't kind of out of the goodness of their hearts that they were changing these rules. The flight attendants that we highlight really had to push them to do it.
Well,
Absolutely.
and I also feel like it's, really important to remember that it was a time when it was fully accepted that you would tell a woman that she didn't deserve to make as much money as a man because a man is taking care of his family and a woman is not. And so it was like, it's important, I think, to remember that that was completely accepted by both genders in America. And it was slowly changing, and women were waking up to. I mean, there were plenty of women who knew they wanted to be paid better. They had children to take care of, and single parents or with a spouse who couldn't work. But this is the awakening of a movement that we're telling here, that becomes empowered by the success of the civil rights movement.
Yeah, absolutely. And to dig into that a little bit more, you guys said it was a little bit difficult to tell the story because there were so many overlapping narratives. The timeline is a little bit difficult to tell because so many things were happening at once. Could you tell me a little bit about what the biggest challenges you faced in telling this story? I'll start with you, Helen.
I might need another second to think about it. I don't know if I have something right off the top. I got to think on it.
I don't know if the sirens are bothering you, but I think that the challenge in some way was a very a dream challenge, which was there was so much material. Like often we're making history films where we're really struggling to figure out how to visually tell a good story. And in this project, the challenge was there was so much material, so much archival, so many photographs that it was like this bounty of riches, but you have to be able to go through it all. You have to keep it organized. You have to figure out how to license it. Like there was so much that we had to be extremely organized, which is part of our job as filmmakers and as history filmmakers. It's always a big organizational challenge. And so that was what kind of, in a way, was the biggest, it was like, whose story do we tell? We have three great stories, but they're all the same. Like these are three stories about fighting against the marriage rule. Well, who's going to tell that story, and who has the best version of that story? So I think in a way, I mean, Helen and I have made a bunch of history films together for American Experience. We've been incredibly privileged to work for that series. I think in this one was a really like a pinnacle for us in many ways because of so much of what we've been talking about in this conversation, of the subject matter, and then just also the process. The process was a challenge, and a sort of like a great challenge.
But you, Helen, do you have any?
I mean, that's really, Sarah really nailed it. I mean, I think it is like, I feel like I would love to just for the rest of my life have phone calls and meetings with retired flight attendants. I mean, they're just the best group, and I feel like they're so, I wouldn't call them red herrings because their anecdotes and their stories are not, they're great, but to decide what to incorporate, what to emphasize, what to highlight, definitely a lot to go through. But yes, again, a very welcome and happy challenge.
Yeah, that's great. Having too much to work with is always a much better problem than not having enough. So another question from the Q&A: were there any government officials who stand out as having helped make the change happen?
Yes. I feel I have a regret, which is that we didn't actually include the Congresswoman from Ohio, whose name is Martha Griffiths. Is that right?
Yes.
Do I have Martha
No.
Griffiths? Wait.
Yeah. That's it.
Yeah, Martha Griffiths. So she was a very sort of, there weren't a lot of female Congress people at this time. And she was advocating for including gender into the Civil Rights Act. And she was also working with Dusty, and she was really involved, and we did not get her into the film. And I sort of regret that. I don't know that much about her, but maybe she's a film. I don't know.
I think she's a film. She's got some interesting things. And then there was, I feel like there was someone else that Dusty was involved with, and he might have been a congressman who was trying to introduce a bill that was in conjunction with what she was trying to do, and it sort of got nowhere. But yes, there were definitely people who were trying to assist.
Jane Stephenson says Martha Griffiths is from Michigan, my hometown.
Sorry. That was a real like East Coast, like, oh, Ohio, Michigan. So sorry.
I just want to point out, I don't know if anybody else noticed this, but everybody's name in this film is so amazing and thematic. Just Dusty Rhodes, amazing. Yeah. Pat Banks. I think there was one woman who was inside one of the government organizations whose last name was Pressman. And I thought that was perfect. So it's just wonderful when little details like that just kind of add up perfectly.
The other thing that we found, and we just laughed a lot in our office about this, which was everybody was named Pat. It was like Mary Pat and Pat. So Pat or Patricia was clearly a very popular name in the sort of 30s and 40s because they were all named Pat. It was just great. We were like trying to keep track of all the Pats.
That's amazing.
Well, and keep your eye out on news for Sonia Pressman Fuentes, because Sarah's got something in the works.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Hear more about her.
Excellent. We'll definitely look out. On that note, also, if people wanted to learn more about flight attendants, what were some of the books or other media sources that you learned a lot from that they could also check out?
Well, I would definitely recommend Julia Cook's book "Come Fly the World," which is about Pan Am and the women of Pan Am. I would also recommend "Femininity in Flight," which is more of a scholarly book about, and that was the book that Helen referenced already by Katie Berry. And then there was a book that came out while we were making this film that's excellent. And what is it called, Helen? The Nell Wolfart book.
Yeah, I'll tell you really quick.
So there are some great books. I don't know about
The Great Stewardess Rebellion is Nell's
yeah,
book.
yeah,
Um,
that's a really good book.
and then Phil T. Myers is Plain Queer, which is also another really good one and really
Yeah.
interesting. Also surprising history that you might not know.
So
Yeah,
oh, sorry, go
Judith.
ahead. Oh,
Mm.
the fight for rights by these flight attendants wasn't necessarily motivated by this like passionate zeal for equality. Well, some of them for sure, but a lot of people in the film mentioned they just wanted to be able to keep working. They didn't want to stop at 32. They didn't want to worry about their weight requirements. They wanted to get married and keep working. So their fight was to remove the impossible conditions on and not necessarily be a feminist advocate or icon, and yet that's what they became in doing so. They fought to remove those conditions. How much of that specificity mattered in their fight versus having a kind of an overreaching, more gender parity rights matter?
I mean, I think if I'm understanding your question, I mean, I'm not sure this is the right addressing what you're asking, but one thing I would say is that there was this, and we worked hard to figure this out, and this somewhat answers a previous question about like, how do you figure out how to tell the story, was that there was a shift that went from fighting for better working conditions within the confines of a woman's job. So the accepting the fact that being a stewardess was a woman's job, then they wanted to be able to be married, or they wanted to be able to have children, or not have to retire. And then there's a shift with the advancing of the women's movement, which is the realization that they wanted to be treated equally to men, that it didn't have to be a woman's job, that this was a job, and that men and women did this job, and men and women should be treated equally in the job. And that was a really important shift that we felt we needed to sort of show in the building of the story.
Mm.
I would add to that, motivation to push back against something can come from many places. And for most, if not all of these women, it came sort of started with their individual issue. Like, I am coming up against something in the job, I want to get married, for example. And so they push to get that change. And in doing so, they realize, oh, this isn't affecting just me. This is affecting my colleagues. And then, in many cases, that kind of empowered them to do more and keep pushing or fight harder, or they're kind of joining together to fight together. And so I think it's really interesting because, yes, specificity mattered a great deal, but then that's initially, but then it's sort of the bigger picture comes into play, and they start to be able to do some incredible things with that.
Mm. And just to round us out here, now's the time to put in your last Q&As. We're rounding out here. For my part, did you have a favorite part of the movie, either because of how it turned out or the memory of that interview, or whatever it took to get that specific archival footage or whatever have you? Let's start with you, Sarah.
I think Helen has sort of touched on it. I think the finding Undra and taking the film to this deeper complexity of not all women are the same, that race matters and changes how you feel about, that the Stewardesses for Women's Rights organization was a great thing and a fascinating thing, but it was really a white women's organization. So finding Andra, who had such an amazing story to tell and sort of had never told her story, felt really gratifying and really. I hope she feels that we did right by her story. I feel very proud of that part of the film, and hopefully, in watching the full film, you do get to a deeper and more complex place that you might not necessarily go to with this story. I feel like it's usually told as a white women's sort of middle class white women, and I think we hopefully kind of told a bigger story.
Absolutely. How about you, Helen?
I would say kind of a big highlight was, and this is less serious, but the ability to work on a film that we were able to inject some humor into it. And we knew, so many of the advertisements are kind of playful and fun or nostalgic. And then you also have the women themselves who are really funny and interesting and can tell these great stories. So I'm just thinking of one moment like where you're able to take something that's kind of so horrific it's laughable and sort of have that reaction. But like I think about one of our interviewees, and again, this is a big tribute to our editor Chuck Wallace, because she made a lot of this happen with her cutting and her timing and imagery,
Yes.
the site she's choosing and the archival she's working in. But I really liked Jean, one of our interviewees, who was talking about having to wear a girdle underneath your uniform, and how the supervisor would flick you to make sure you were wearing your girdle. And like one little moment that we were able to do was like make a little sound, she does it on camera and then you hear this little sound effect. Or Cha put in, a typewriter sound when Dusty's talking about going to the EEOC for the first time. So there, in some ways, there are things we're talking about that are quite serious and deep and monumental and history changing, and then other things are kind of light and fun and colorful. And it was great to be able to do a little of both.
Yeah.
And I would just, Helen, I love that you brought that up. And I would also say just these films are a team effort, and we are so lucky to work with the incredibly talented people that we get to work with. And so this was a collaborative and incredibly fun process, and everyone who we worked with brought so much to the table. And it just like, our composer and our graphics person, and it's just like everything, the film just builds and builds, and then you get to this final piece. And it's a really fun, I think we both really love the process.
Absolutely. As an audio professional, thank you for the shout out. I love to hear it. I also too love sound design. I love it when that really hits. We have one last question, and I think if I'm understanding it correctly, when do stewardesses form unions? I think that means when
Yeah,
in
when
history. Yeah.
Yeah, so it started in the 40s. The first unions were in the 40s, and we tell that story in the film. And the union story is complicated. And so we did the best we could to tell it. We simplified it. And again, I think Nell Wolfart's book, The Great Stewardess Rebellion, is a really good read if you're interested in the union story.
Absolutely. All right, we are closing out here. Thank you both so much for your time. I very much enjoyed the film. For those who haven't seen it yet, absolutely watch it immediately. Tell your friends. I got a little teary-eyed, I have to say, while I was watching it. It's definitely inspiring and really well done with how complicated and overlapping so many issues were happening at the same time. So I really commend you both for the work that you both did. If there's anything that I'll ask one last question here, which is, what do you hope people take away from this film? And then we'll close out from there. So let's start with you, Helen. What do you hope people take away from this film?
I hope they perhaps went in thinking one thing and came out with some new information or a changed mind or a deeper understanding. I also think, on a sort of more personal level, the idea that these women were just kind of, regular people, quote unquote, and they made big things happen, just by trying really hard and persevering. And so the power of the individual to make change is, for me, a big takeaway from the film.
How about you, Sarah?
I mean, I absolutely second that. And then I would also say what is so, this is a little bit, because Helen has said that, I can say this, which is that this film was made for public television, that PBS and GBH in Boston is a very, important place for telling stories. And this wouldn't have happened without GBH and without American Experience. And in the current times when those outlets are really threatened, I think we need to think about what we might lose if we don't have the outlet. And so we're really grateful to GBH for giving us the platform to tell this story.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all both so much for your time. Ann Keeley says, excellent presentation, ladies. Thanks. Thank you all. I'm Jasmine with the Globe, and we really appreciate you all joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jasmine.
Thank you.